Welcome to Old Path and our weekly study through the New Testament. We are currently in the book of Revelation. We have the second part of chapter 10 to deal with today and the first few verses in chapter 11. We are at a particular part in the text that's really, of course, very interesting, and it's in a section that has a lot of description given to us. If you were with us last week, you'll know that we looked at the first part of chapter 10, and there's an angel that's there, and there's a lot of attributes, a lot of detail that's given, which has led to an awful lot of speculation. Some of it's pretty odd, and others are just, again, we're not told with any specifics why some of the details are there. So it's best not to jump outside of what's, something that we can actually make a case for in the text. We have a continuation of that today, all the way into the description that's given of the two witnesses. That's going to come up today. And what I want to do on a couple of these little portions that are there are a couple of options that we have in the way that we can interpret this. Now, it's not going to change greatly what we see. It's more just some of the details that we get that surround the personages, some of the imagery and whatnot. So again, we'll always take the literal interpretation of this book and that it's future, literal and future. If you're not really familiar with all of those terms, you can go back to the very first studies that we did in this book. And so it's been almost 6 months. Couldn't believe it. I looked it up the other day. It's been about 6 months since we started this. But there are different views that some would relegate what we're looking at here to a particular period of time, some that narrow it down very specifically to the fall of Jerusalem at 70 AD at the hands of the Romans. Others have a much more spiritualized and allegory, that kind of a thing, that it really isn't speaking about anything specific to a time past or future, but it's really just speaking in symbols and allegory and all the rest. And the problem with that view is you can have 100 people and you'll have 100 opinions. So it's when you start to read into things and say, well, God's not speaking literally here. And yet so much of the scripture, God speaks very much literally. So whoever it is believes that they have the right to say what God is meaning literally as opposed to figuratively and allegorical. Man does not have the right to say what is and what is not. Now, there's times that God uses figurative language, no question. I've pointed out a number of places in here where John is saying, what I saw was like, or it was similar to. And so he's sometimes using imagery and symbols and whatnot to try to explain to us things that just don't exist to our eyes in the current world the way that it is. Of course, this is all going to be something, if you look at it from a future and a literal perspective, the stuff that's being spoken about here, the world's never seen before. So much of it is not even of this dimension or of this reality, if you will. So the idea that things would be happening on Earth that are without precedent in human history shouldn't surprise any of us, because we're ultimately going to get to the point where we're looking at the eternal of things. So man, in his temporal, finite, broken situation of this world, the idea that what awaits us is something that's eternal and perfect and without any corruption. Of course, we've never seen anything like that on earth as humans, not since before the fall, and Adam and Eve would have been the only ones to see it. So the idea that there are things still future that we have no way of trying to reckon or understand in our lives shouldn't come as any surprise. So it's with that understanding that we take the literal view of this. And in that literal view, once again, we're looking at things that John is given and describing that he's doing his best to try to make it understandable to our eye and to our understanding. But it's just stuff that's never been seen with human eyes other than his. And perhaps Paul saw some stuff. Paul saw some things that he was quiet about. But some of the things that we're seeing here, Paul mentions kind of in passing at around verse 26 of 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And so he describes things about Jesus returning the kingdom back to the Father and putting death to death, and that Hades and hell would be judged. it's all kind of Revelation kind of stuff, 30 years roughly before the events. So Paul saw some things too, and he was told not to write about them. So just kind of an interesting thing that we see in John's reckoning of this and his information that he gives to us. It's quite unique. It's quite interesting, and yet nonetheless, since it isn't something that we've ever seen before, doesn't mean that we need to default to the idea, well, he must be speaking about in poetic or allegorical or however you want to say it, symbolic language. You can still take the literal interpretation of this, and you will do no violence to the text whatsoever. So that should always be our objective as believers, never to do violence to the text or make it say something that it does not say. So there will be a couple of places that will have alternative ways of looking at it, and I'll point those out as we get to it. And again, very, very interesting section that we have here in front of us. What I want to do is we'll recap a little bit what we looked at last week, and because it really kind of fits very nicely into where we are today. Obviously, it's chapter 10, but it's broken into two sections, and we'll look at that as a quick review. So Revelation chapter 10, let's turn there and let's have a word of prayer, and we'll jump into the study. Father, we thank you so much for the time that we can spend here in your word. We would ask, Lord, that you would give us understanding as we settle these matters in our own minds best as we can, and leaving some of the things that could mean more than one possible explanation of them, variations, if you will. And we pray that you would give us the understanding why these things matter and why should we care about them, with the details that you give to us, Lord, the conclusions that we can draw from it. So we thank you, we give you all praise, and ask that you would open our eyes to your word, and we give you all praise in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so when we get to chapter 11, just so you know, I'll be putting up an image because, again, a lot of this is very speculative because it talks about things that are going to be present on this earth. The church is not here for it, but there will be people here on earth, and we're given some very specific details that are here. And it's going to play into the world as we know it right now, because Jerusalem is Jerusalem. Israel is Israel. That's what's being spoken of at the location where these events are taking place. So there's no reason to try to allegorize that and say it's really not Jerusalem, it's really not Israel, it means this. Garbage. So what we're looking at here is very, very Jewish. And the imagery here is incredibly Jewish. There's no reason to try to go outside of just literally looking at this the way that it is. And if that's the case, as we look at the nation of Israel and again of Jerusalem, this stuff really fits very, very nicely, even with the world as it exists at this moment. And what there is of the Jewish nation and of the Muslim influence that there is in Jerusalem, especially as far as the Temple Mount is concerned. So with that being said, let's take a look at a little bit of what we looked at last week. And it's kind of the imagery where you see here in chapter 10, verse 1, not even the imagery, but there's the angel, and then there are the things descriptive of this particular angel that really kind of play into where we are here today. So it says, I saw another angel, mighty angel rather, coming down from heaven, clothed with a cloud, and a rainbow was on his head, and his face was like the sun, feet like pillars of fire. A lot of people see that description as trying to say each one of those elements has to relate to something that we see in the Old Testament or maybe something symbolically in the New. There's nothing that tells us we have to do that. It may very simply be John giving description of what this person looked like. So again, you'll see plenty of people that will speculate one way or the other. Is it just John doing his best to try to give us his description of what this looked like to his eye? Or is there symbolism behind clouds and rainbows and pillars and all of that? So we went through it last week if you want to take a look at it. Importantly, in verse 2, it says, he had a little book open in his hand, and he set his right foot on the sea and his left foot on the land. Some people, again, see symbolism there as the difference between Jews and Gentiles. But why was one foot on the land and one foot on the earth, or the water rather than changing feet and having the foot located in the other foot or in reverse? Again, there's a lot of speculation on that. The important part is that he had this book that's already open, and it says, and he set his right foot on the sea and the other foot on the land, and he cried with a loud voice as when a lion roars, and the seven thunders uttered their voices. So John is hearing these things, and he's about to write it down, and he's told not to. So there are these thunderings, which is it's a description that he's had before. That kind of gives us more of an idea of the magnitude and the volume of things. And so he likens it to a lion that roars, and it's the sound of it, but there are voices in these thunders. Now, again, it's really mystical the way that it's described to us, but it was enough that he would be able to say, I know what's being said here. Now, of course, it's not a whisper, it's not a regular voice. It is something that commands enormous attention. So it's twofold. It's thunders as like when a lion roars. That's supposed to let us know there's some real magnitude to this. And then there is detail that's given, and he's about to write it down. So he's got information that is he thinks pertinent, and then he is told don't write it down. It's not information to be known at this point in time. Again, there are some that would speculate it really is all of what's about to be explained to us, and yet it would be the same at that point as what's the content of the book itself. So again, there's a lot of different ways that people can look at this. Whatever it is that they're going to utter, if it is something that we're going to see that unfolds later on in this book, that would fit fine. If it's something that is completely unattached to this and we don't know about it until some future date after we've left this earth, and that's a possibility as well, there's no sense in getting into an argument over it because you just simply cannot prove it. Great rule of thumb. There are a lot of people who, especially with this book, and with end times things in particular, who will tell us that they've got some really kind of unique and keen type of insight that the Lord has shown them. And you see it, watch YouTube, and you see it all the time of people, and I've had it here when people will comment on YouTube that you're not understanding this, and then they get into Trump and other presidents and the nation itself and the United Nations and Manhattan and the U.S. being Babylon and all this stuff that the Lord showed me. Well, some of them are just absolutely out there and kind of, I don't think really all that attached rather to reality. Other people that have this, well, I'm telling you this because the Lord showed me. Well, if the Lord quote showed you something, please don't assume that he hasn't already spoken to other people who have a different opinion than what you have. It's really kind of the height of arrogance and pride to say, well, everybody else that would come to this has said that they've prayed and that they really believe that this is what the Lord has shown them, but somehow you have a superior knowledge. At times, people that I've dealt with don't even realize that they're sounding that prideful and arrogant. And so it just assumes that because it's your knowledge that it's superior to everyone else's. I see a lot of that in Revelation and the way that people interpret these things. So what I want to try on a personal level myself is never to get to that place of saying, well, this is the way that it is, and anybody else who says otherwise is wrong. I'll give you, if it's just kind of, it could be this or that, or maybe this, if it's 2 or 3 or even 4 options, I'll give you all of those. And if I'm kind of locked in on one particular, it's great. This is kind of my view of the whole thing, but I reserve the right to be wrong, as that old saying goes. And it is something, again, because of look at how mysterious this is. You could very easily go running off into all kinds of directions and get into all kinds of folly, which is what we want to avoid. So unless it's something that we can absolutely nail down, let's go ahead and look at our options. That's fine. But to stand dogmatically on one particular point when you cannot prove it all the way to the end is just folly, and it's just never useful. So anyway, as we look at this, again, going on a little bit further, these thunders utter their voices, verse 4, and then when these 7 thunders uttered their voices, I was about to write, but I heard a voice from heaven. This is not the angel, I don't believe. This is really kind of the Lord speaking directly to him, because he's ultimately the one giving, if you will, all of the orders kind of moment by moment. But I heard a voice from heaven saying to me, seal up the things that are in these 7 thunders that have been uttered, and do not write them down. Then the angel whom I saw standing on the sea and on the land raised his hand to heaven, and he swore by him who lives forever and ever, who created heaven and the things that are there, the earth and the things that are in it, and the sea and the things that are in it, that there should be no further delay. And but in the days of the sounding of the seventh angel, when he is about to sound, the mystery of God should be revealed, and he declared to his servants, the prophets. That's going to run until we get to chapter 11, verse 14, and that last trumpet is going to sound. So that's what's in view here, that it's about to take place. And so all of what we're seeing to this point, there's something that really kind of starts to take a different view, or I guess a different emphasis, the severity and the human cost, the carnage that's going to start taking place at the seventh trumpet really kind of puts it in a different category. And so again, it's all God, of course, doing these things. It's, I believe, the wrath that has always been spoken about here, but it's really on the intensity scale is going to really ramp up, and we're about to be introduced to some personages. One who's been there all along. I believe that the rider on the white horse that we see in the very first seal, when we put it in light, and I'll get to this in a little bit, of what we see in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, he's been there all along. The Jews have been able to be sacrificing all along on the front end of this 7 years. There are two verses here in chapter 11 that help us to understand that there's a break in that 7 years at the midway point, 3.5 years. So there are a couple of things here where we know where the witnesses are for sure. Are they in the first or the second half? There's another part of this about the Gentiles and the treading of the city of Jerusalem. Is that intended to be the first half or the second half? And there's disagreements on that. But there's some really, really interesting stuff that goes on here. So we'll get to that in due course. But what we have here is the second half of chapter 10 is John was told, don't write the things that the voices are saying. But there is something else that comes up here, and that is chapter 10, starting at verse 8. Now that book that he saw that was in the hand of the angel, he is told to go and take possession of it, and there's some content in it that has some very interesting, I guess you could say, kind of the effect that it has on him. So let's just go ahead and read verses 8 to 11, and then we'll go back and kind of take it apart. In verse 8 it says, "So the voice which I heard from heaven spoke to me again." Now, going back, it's like, let's go back to these things, and here's the angel saying these things again, second time. Spoke to me again, saying, "Now go and take the little book which is in the hand of the angel who stands on the sea and on the earth." So again, verses 1 and 2 of chapter 10, going right back to where we had been. There's this little kind of in-between type of thing, it's kind of a parentheses within this parenthetical section. And I see this angel, and there's a whole bunch of commotion, stuff that's taking place. But as I'm about to write it down, John's saying, I was told not to. Now he's getting new direction. Here's what you're supposed to do. And there's some imagery that's here. And let me go ahead and just point it out. The idea of consuming a book. We see it, Ezekiel chapter 3, and the imagery that's here, Jeremiah, I think 15 is where it is. So the idea of consuming something doesn't mean that you literally eat it, because what could you learn from eating, pages and words on a page? Of course you don't. This is again one of those places where you have imagery that is not literal, but it's speaking of something else. So the word here for eat could be consumed in its totality. You devour this thing. So why he didn't just say, here, read this book? It's something that he is supposed to consume. So that's the imagery that's here. We'll look at that a little bit more as we go through it. So I went to this angel, said to him, give me the little book. And he said to me, take it and eat it, and it will make your stomach bitter, but it will be as sweet as honey in your mouth. Now, that idea that it would cause bitterness, that's also something that we see when something is revealed, the effect that it has on the person. So of those major prophets, we're talking about Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and Daniel. In their writings, you can find the same kind of symbolism about a book that was given to them, the idea of consuming it in what seems to be, of course, it's speaking figurative language, but it's the idea of consuming it in its totality. So if it's a book that has content, of course, that's more that you're to understand the content of it, consuming it, eating it. Again, if we want to say, well, it has to be literal, you got to make up your mind. If it's literal, it's literal. If it's not, it's not. Again, there's times that the Bible, and in Revelation in particular, yeah, you're talking about literal things that take place, and then there's other times that it's using symbolic language. So again, if I was just say, okay, great, rip a page out of your Bible and eat it, you want to tell me you can understand the content by consuming it that way? Let's just use a little common sense here. So in verse 10, so I took the little book out of the angel's hand and I ate it, and it was sweet as honey in my mouth. But when I had eaten it, my stomach became bitter. And I think of Daniel. When you look at chapters 7 and 8 of Daniel's book, his letter, or however you want to put it, the book of Daniel, he sees the 4 world empires. And so he sees the Babylonians to the Persians to the Greeks to the Romans. He is so deeply troubled by the 4th beast, which is the Roman Empire, and what it is, it sickens him. And so we get that by the end of the 8th chapter. After God shows him this and reveals what it is, he's just sick to his stomach. It causes him kind of a sickness and a nausea because he sees everything that's there. God's revealing to him the end of things. By chapter 9, we start to get into the section of his writing that corresponds directly with what we're studying right here and in these next few chapters of the Antichrist and that world system that's going to be set up. Daniel sees it in detail. But again, go back and read chapter 7 and 8 and watch his reaction at the end of chapter 8, and you'll see it's that same kind of bitterness and sickness of his stomach when he starts to see what is all there. And we understand this in a human sense. How many times have you seen things that are so hard for you to wrap your minds around, you get sick to your stomach over it? And some people have that reaction more so than others. Well, that's kind of what's going on here as far as John is concerned. What he sees is so deeply troubling to him that it has that physical effect on him. So this is what he sees. Again, not unusual. All right. So verse 11 says, and so he said to me, you must prophesy, and that's again about many peoples, nations, tongues, and kings. So that's the closeout of chapter 10. Now let's go back and take a look a little bit at the importance of what's being said here, because once again, if you'll notice what John is being shown here, this is the interval of time between the sounding of the 6th trumpet and into the 7th. So this is a little bit of if you will, a parenthetic of what takes place. Now, it's giving some details about the things that had gone on. When we get to the 2 witnesses of chapter 11, they've been there for the first 3.5 years all the way along. We're just now told about them in chapter 11. So it's not as though the entirety of their reign and not their reign, but their witness on the earth, it's not that it just happened between the 6th and the 7th trumpet. They've been there all along. So we'll get to that in due course. So again, what we're getting here is John giving us some details about here's some other things that are happening. They're happening in real time between the 6th and 7th trumpet, but some of it, even though he gives us the description and they're there at the time that he sees it, as with the 2 witnesses, they've been there all along. So that helps us in our understanding. This also points out to us that the temple has been there since the beginning. And so we know that when we start to take a look at what we see in Daniel chapter 7, that all of that stuff, he brings it to a stop halfway through the tribulation. That's what we get in verse 27 of Daniel 9. In the middle of that week, those 7 years, he brings an end to all of the offerings because he's now going to turn the direction of the worship to himself and away from what the Jews think is their worship of God. We'll save a little bit of that until chapter 11 as we do that later on today. So back to verse 8. So this voice which I heard from heaven spoke with me again, and he said, "Now go and take the little book which is open in the hand of the angel who stands on the sea and on the earth." So John is told, you've seen this image of the angel. Now that book that's there, until this point, John doesn't have any idea that it's information that is to be given to him. And I believe it relates with that last verse, verse 11. It's the content, I believe, of what is about to be given to him. It's an interesting thing, because why a book? To this point, there hasn't been, the revelation has been as it goes along. He's just told these things. But now there's a different element that's unique to this point, where there is a book that's given to him. Now it's a smaller book, and the scrolls that Jesus were given, let's make it easy for our understanding. It's basically derived from the same word. So what we get as could be book or scroll that Jesus has would be larger, if you will, as a volume. There's more detail in it. What John sees here is a smaller version, seemingly, of, well, it's again, when you look at the scroll that Jesus had, it's about the directions or the directives, if you will, of the Father wanting to see these things taken. It's kind of a testament, of a will, if you will, of what he wants to see taking place, and Jesus is the one who executes the details of it. But that's the entirety. That's the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls is all in that. Within that, there is another book that is given here, and there is detail that's given in it as well, because John is then seen. He's able to see what it is. It makes sense that since it has that effect on him of the difficulty of things and the human toll, that clearly isn't something that's well into the future, because there's nothing to be sickened over when it comes to the forever kingdom. So he's certainly not, it's got to be something that is from the time of everything that we've studied so far. Going forward, it's the next 3.5 years of the tribulation and into what will happen in the millennium. So again, is it perhaps details about the millennium, which we don't get a lot of detail in Revelation? Whatever it is, it's a bittersweet kind of a thing to him. So interestingly enough, we'll get to that here in just a moment. So he was told, do this, go to that angel. And again, can you imagine how intimidating that would be? I'm told, go to this angel who's great, and there's something that he has in his hand. Now, that idea that he goes and makes some demand of the angel already knows that John is coming to take it. The directive is given directly from the throne. John, go to that angel, take the book from him. So when we see in verse 9, so I went to the angel and said to him, give to me the little book. It's the language helps us to understand in the original, it's not a demand. It's like, well, give me that. That would be arrogance. Instead, he's seen who this angel is, at least in the attributes, and this would be a very intimidating kind of a thing. It's more that John goes to him in the sense, I was told to take the book, so I'm asking for the book that is supposed to be given to me. There's no demands made here. Again, the language makes it, he kind of acquiesces to what is being told for him to do, and the angel does likewise. It has always been the intention that God wants this book given to John. John comes and asks for it as he has been sent there to receive it. So, so he said to me, take and eat it, and it will make your stomach bitter, but it will also be as sweet as honey in your mouth. So again, how is something bitter sweet? If the content of the book is, as I believe that it is, details that maybe we're going to get, it may be the things that John writes from this point on, or it could even be other things that are not recorded for us, because there would be clearly other things going on that are just said in the very general sense. It's a worldwide judgment on all of those who are left on the earth who have rejected Jesus. So clearly, this is the stuff that he would be seeing. If he saw all of the detail, we're only given glimpses, big picture stuff. But if he's given a book here that might have a lot more details that's hidden from us, the sweetness part of it is what we know towards the end of it, when the Lord returns to the earth and he sets up his kingdom. That's a sweet thing. That's wonderful. It's the Lord is going to come back among his creation and he's going to rule and reign in righteousness. That's great. It's the human toll that will happen between here and there. John, being a fellow human being, is seeing, if nothing else, what he's seen so far and what he will be seeing in the bowls is going to be just unimaginable carnage. The human toll is just off the charts, almost impossible for us to even begin to grasp the magnitude of it. So that's kind of where we are in I guess what we can say is what we think may very well be. So if that's the bittersweet, it makes sense. What is bitter? What is sweet? Bitterness, the human cost, the sweetness, the Lord comes back at the end of it. Again, it's what fits to me what we're seeing in this actual book and what is being revealed to us. So it would seem that whatever the content of this book is has to fit within what's taking place in the world going forward. And we do know those details. What is between here and eternity, what happens? There's the remainder of the 3.5 years, midway of the tribulation. We know that because of what is in chapter 11 here. But we also know what happens in the millennium, and we have that little bit of detail. We have a lot more detail looking from chapters 40 through 48 of the book of Ezekiel. So again, if somebody tries to tell you they know what's in this book, they don't. We can say there's some things. Why would a book be shown to him? Why is this detail given to us? Why is it written down for us and all the generations after John sees it, unless it has something pertinent to what we're reading going forward from chapters 11 through, basically 19 when Jesus shows back up, and then into 20 when all the rest of those things take place. Is John just given more vivid detail about some of the other things happening simultaneous? But in the big picture, it's God wrapping up his judgment of man on earth, leading to the rule of Jesus on the earth, and then leading to eternity. It fits. So, again, if there's some other potential of what it is, the Lord has not given us more detail than what's here. So again, we can speculate, but to stand dogmatically is just, it's something that we're not given enough detail to do so. So he takes a little book out of the angel's hand. He ate it, and it was sweet as honey in his mouth, or in my mouth. But when I had eaten it, my stomach became bitter. Exactly what he was told is exactly what happens. And so this angel then said to me, you must prophesy again about many peoples, nations, tongues, and kings, which he has done to this point. So when we see again, it's almost as though everything that he had done to that point, he's giving us the details about the trumpets and the seals and all that stuff. He's been giving that, progressively going through it, telling us what's been happening moment to moment. Now he sees in chapter 10 this angel having this book. Clearly there is much more about to take place. We know that because of what we saw at the close of last week's study, those last couple of verses, verses 6 and 7. Knowing that the sounding of the 7th trumpet is about to open up a whole brand new bunch of things that will be taking place. And again, the severity, the intensity, and the human toll is about to pick up exponentially. It's going to be massive in the implication of it. So this is what he's seeing real time. Now this angel says to him, all right, now since you've seen what you've seen in this book, and it may very well correspond to what's coming next, what he's told is that now that you've seen that little bit, it's time for you to start speaking again. You're going to prophesy, which is a way of saying, this is what God has said before. This is now when it's starting to take place. He's the prophet speaking what has been discussed before. Old Testament has given lots of glimpses of this, and we're going to see that imagery quite a bit in chapter 11. But here's an interesting thing. Now, in the differing views, excuse me, in the differing views that we have of this book, there are some that would say it's not future. It's all been done in times past. We refer to that as the people who hold to a preterist view. From the Latin preter means that it's already taken place. Just loose translation to English. They will take the view nah, this isn't happening somewhere in the future. It's already happened in the past. And if you say, okay, well, what happened in the past? For those who would say, well, it's actually just talking about when the Romans came in under Titus and they sacked Jerusalem in 70 AD. That's really what we're looking at here. And in the aftermath of that, that's what's in focus here. So it's talking about the first century and the kind of dissolution meant of Israel as a nation, and putting them, basically displacing them from the land and conquering Jerusalem, and thereby, putting an end to Jewish possession, if you will, of their homeland. That's what they're talking about. This is a problematic verse for that view. Why is that? Well, he's told, it was told to me, here's what you must do. You must prophesy again. Pick up your pen, if you will, or speak these things through, because you're going to speak about this, about many peoples, nations, tongues, and kings. So if that's the case, it's just kind of poetic language for saying all of humanity. Here's what you need to do. You have to start addressing the whole of creation, all of mankind. And so that's why you're taking from the least to the greatest, from kings all the way down. You're going to talk about nations and tongues, which puts it well outside of Judaism. So if that's the case, where people will say, oh no, this is only talking about what happened by the hands of the Romans to Israel and Jerusalem, well, here we're told that you're supposed to be speaking to really the world as a whole, and not just narrowed down to Israel, not just narrowed down to Jerusalem, not just narrowed down to the Jews and the Romans. So here again, this argues against the idea that we put this back 2,000 years to the conquering of Jerusalem. So anyway, people will disagree on that, but that's fine. But still, again, this is problematic to those people who try to make it fit some historical place in history when it doesn't fit. This is the way of just saying it's universal judgment. And if you want to speak about universal things, here's how you would say it: peoples, nations, tongues, and kings. So, verse 1, chapter 11. Then I was given a rod, and that was like a measuring rod, a reed, which was like a measuring rod. And the angel stood, saying, rise and measure the temple of God, the altar, and those who worship there. But leave out the court which is outside of the temple, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the Gentiles, and they will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months. And then I will give power over my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy 1,160 days, clothed in sackcloth. These are the 2 olive trees and the 2 lampstands standing before God on the earth. And if anyone wants to harm them, fire proceeds from their mouth and devours their enemies. And if anyone wants to harm them, they must be killed in like manner. These 2 have the power to shut heaven, and no rain falls in the days of their prophecy, and they have power over water to turn it into blood, and to strike the earth with all the plagues as often as they desire. Now, you already seen I have put up what is an aerial view of the Temple Mount. So if we take literally what we read in Daniel's prophecy of the 70 weeks, this is that last 7 years. Daniel explains it starting at verse 24, and by verse 27, chapter 9, verse 24 through verse 27, you'll read all of the things that are there, that there is one still remaining 7-year period, and that's what we're studying here in the book of Revelation. But in the middle of that those 7 years, that last week, if you will, notice in verse 27, it says that there is a midway point when he brings an end to those offerings. So that's where we are in the text as we are seeing this. This is we're at that midway point. So these prophets, the 2 witnesses that are here, it's the word for witness is where we get the word martyr. And it is speaking about these 2 people who are prophesying in that area. Now, of course, there's all kinds of speculation as to who these people are. Now, I don't doubt for a moment that they are literal personages. Are they people that we would recognize from the history of Israel? There is reason to believe that that's the case, and I'll explain why that is. They may be people that we've never seen before. They just happen to have some characteristic things that are reminiscent of a couple of figures that we see in the Old Testament. We'll get to that. You probably already know the two that are usually mentioned here. Again, there are people who speculate in this, and this is where I get to that point. People try to make the case it's Moses and Elijah. Fine, if it is, that's great. Or they have another combination of two other people. Great, fine. We're just simply not told. We're told a little bit about them, but as far as I'm concerned, whoever they are really doesn't matter as much as what they do and some of the attributes of them. So again, is it, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. I'll explain to you why there's some problems even with Moses and Elijah, that we stand dogmatically on that. I don't want to do that. Let's just look at chapter 11 in its detail going forward, and I'll bring down that picture of the Temple Mount. You know what? Let me leave it up for just a moment. When we look at this, what you're looking at is that golden dome that's kind of right in the middle of that big rectangular area. That's the Dome of the Rock. It's the kind of iconic, you know exactly what you're looking at when you see it. It's in pictures all over the place. What you don't necessarily hear of an awful lot, that's more of a shrine. If you look to the left of it, there's that black dome, and that's on the southern end. That's known as the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So those are two very prominent places to Islam, and there is the question about, well, where will they end up putting the temple that we know will be there? And so drawing your attention, as you're looking at this picture, just know that as you look at that black dome, that's the southern portion. So that means that when you look at the golden dome, that's kind of like right in the middle of it. And from the perspective that we're looking at it, what is to the bottom of the screen is to the east, and the upper part of the screen is to the west. That means that that big open area that you have is to the north. And that north is kind of an open plaza kind of an area, and there's good reason to believe that that may very well be where they will end up putting the temple. Now, you'll get people will disagree on this. Some will say, oh, no, the whole thing, the temple is going to be rebuilt much further to the south, not even up on that plateau, and there's all kinds of reasons that they do it. My reason for believing it's going to be here is because of the symbolism that's behind it. If you're Jewish, there's no way that you want for a moment for that to be left open and just left over to the Muslims. That part in their mind is far too important for them not to build on that location. And if added to that, if anybody was able to broker so much of a peace where they could get the Muslims to agree to allow the Jews to build a temple right on the Temple Mount next to the Dome of the Rock, you would be seen as unlike anybody that the world has ever produced if you can make that happen. Because just look at how tense everything is there right now. Imagine the idea of somebody being able to get the Muslims to agree to allow the Jews to build the temple there. That person is going to be celebrated in ways we can't even fully grasp. All right, now let me bring that down. So we read back in the text, once again, rise and measure the temple of God, these three things. You're to measure the temple itself, measure the altar, and those who worship there. Now, the measuring here, it can be literally, I want the measurements. How many feet, how many, what's the width, what's the height, what's the length, all of that kind of stuff. You can also have it where you're to measure, and that's to make an assessment or a judgment about it. So in the way of if you're going to report something on it. So do I believe that he's literally taking measurements of the size of it? Yeah, I do believe that. But there's also an assessment. As you're assessing this, you're also assessing those who are actually there, and they're actively involved in the worship that's taking place in the temple. Now, what's unusual about it, when you go back and do yourself a favor, you can take a look online and find all kinds of information about the original temple and Temple Mount, the various ones from Solomon all the way up through Herod. And the one that's going to be during this time of this 7 years is going to be very much just focused on only the Jewish things. And they're actually, it's at times past, the Jews, whenever they would have their temple, all of the outer courts and even the places that wouldn't have a technical function still were pretty much considered kind of the temple place, and it was really left for Jews alone. In this case, all of those outer things are more for the Gentiles because God's having them, at this time, they're only focused on their own things. And so they don't care about the outer courts. They don't care about any of the rest of that stuff. This is my guess. It's probably part of that peace that's going to be brought that you'll find that Daniel talks about. That peace is going to finally come to an end during this time. So we're going to get that in the next couple of chapters. So what I believe is that when the Jews are given the ability to build the temple, they're going to say, we don't care about all that stuff. We care only about being able to get back to what is the temple as we know it, the reason for sacrifices, and all the rest of that stuff that will be taking place. And it's going to be in the first half primarily of this 3.5 years. And we know that because of the description that we've already read. So he's told, here, take your assessment and do this. But here's what I want you to do. Here's the direction that he's given. But leave out the court, which is outside of the temple, and do not measure it. And why is that? For it has been given to the Gentiles, and they will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months. So don't concern yourself with worrying about the outer courts. Here's God being able to say, I've given that over to the Gentiles. So this is, again, since God is doing judgment of the entirety of the earth, at the same time, this is he's dealing with his nation and the many that will come to him through this, but he's also dealing with the Gentiles at the same time. Now, here's the disagreement that you'll have in even people who have a literal interpretation view of the book of Revelation. The 3.5 years, the time of the Gentiles, is it speaking about the first half that's been given to the Gentiles, or is it speaking of the second half? So will the Gentiles tread the holy city for the latter part of it, or is it for the first part of it? So you'll have those that would say, well, since the Gentiles have had run of it this whole time, then it must be speaking about the latter portion of it, that during that time when the Antichrist is going to be doing the things that he does, he's going to displace the Jews. We know that because he's going to bring an end to those sacrifices. And by the ridding of the temple and the Temple Mount area, by ridding the world of the Jews who are offering there, then the Gentiles can have control of the entirety of the city. Some see that as the point. Others would see that it's speaking about this time as being only the first half, that the Gentiles have been able to have their run of the Al-Aqsa area, of the Dome of the Rock area. But when the devil sets up himself, or the Antichrist sets himself up for worship, then that's not really given over to the Gentiles. It's really given over to the Antichrist, and he's the one who treads everything. So there's a couple of views that you could look at. And so is it the latter part being in focus here of the 3.5, or is it the first 3.5 that's mentioned here? So you could hear people make credible cases for either side, and I've kind of in big picture laid out what both sides are. It's meant, what is the trampling of the city underfoot by the Gentiles? If that's the case, that we're talking about, well, they've been able to be on the Temple Mount all along, and so their whole time is going to be really then magnified when the Jews are actually gone from it entirely, or does the time of the Gentiles come to an end when the devil sets himself up? And so we do know that there will be definitely a displacement of the Jews. That's for sure. That we know. And so that's going to happen at the abomination of desolation. That's when the Jews are not going to be able to enter the temple, because the devil's going to set himself up there. We're going to get to that in chapter 3, or 13 rather. Chapter 13 is where we get that, and the run up to it is actually in chapter 12. I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves because there's a lot of detail that we still need to deal with. So here's what he's told. measure the temple, the altar, so that you know where the place of corporate worship for the Jews is, and also make the assessment of the people who were there. As for the outer portions of it, leave the outer court that is outside of the temple and do not measure it. It's not for your concern. Don't worry about that, because it has been given to the Gentiles, and they will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months. That's just 3.5 years. So the question is the placement. And no matter which side you come out on, is it the first half or the second half, it doesn't really change anything as far as our understanding of the book or the judgments or any of those things. It's just what is meant by this. And again, credible people I've seen on both sides of this argument, and again, they'll make a very credible argument for both. I tend to believe it's more on the front end of it, but again, it's one of those things. It's easy to persuade people one way or the other by the argument that you make on it. So, verse 3. Now, the question is this still the angel speaking? Because if it is the angel that's speaking, if they're speaking for themselves, this is the idea that this is deity speaking. So is it an angel that speaks in verses 1 and 2, and then at verse 3, now another voice comes in, and it depends on what manuscript you use. Some manuscripts, the older Greek, depending on which one you're looking at, it gives the impression that it's still the angel that's speaking. Other ones give the impression that it's now from the throne that's speaking. Certainly, we know this for absolutely sure. Whoever's voice this is definitely is deity. And how do we know that? I'll show you. So it says, now I will give power to my 2 witnesses. So we notice that in verse 1 of chapter 11, it's an angel that speaks. If it's the angel that is still speaking, here's the 3 possibilities that are put out there. It's either that this angel is deity himself, or that this angel has the ability to speak of God as though these are his words, I'm just uttering them. So that's the option. Or, as I've mentioned, is there a change? It's no longer the angel that was speaking in verses 1 and 2, and now it's God speaking directly for himself, because he identifies these witnesses as belonging to him. An angel does not possess these people in the way that they don't belong to him. So they belong to God. They're his witnesses. So no matter how you slice it, it is God who speaks here. If it was that former angel of verses 1 and 2, then that angel would have had to have been God himself, or speaking. If he's still speaking, he's speaking as God gives him the utterance to do. That's a stretch as far as I'm concerned. I favor the idea that the angel spoke in verses 1 and 2. In verse 3, there's a change of speaker here. We're just not told that with the detail, but we do know that the speaker must be God because the witnesses belong to him. I will give power to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy 1,260 days clothed in sackcloth. Now notice this is another way of saying 3.5 years. We were just given one way of saying 42 months. Okay, so 12 months to a year, it's 3.5 years. In this case, this is how many days there would be 3.5 years. So it's the imagery is used here of saying 3.5 years. It's just much fancier language in both cases. So I'm going to give power to my 2 witnesses. They will prophesy 1,260 days clothed in sackcloth. And so what we know is this has to be on the front end. It's the first half of the tribulation, because they're put to death, which we'll study next week. And then everything else continues on for the next 3.5 years. So this part, we can absolutely say their prophecy, or the things that they're testifying to, their witnesses, their martyrs, they're the ones who are giving testimony. They can only continue for that 3.5 years on the front end, because they're put to death by the beast. So we'll get to that as we look next week. So they prophesy for 1,260 days in sackcloth, which is very similar to a way of outward mourning. You find that sackcloth was something very Old Testament in its understanding. It's uncomfortable. It's made of goat hair. It's just kind of, it's abrasive to the skin. It's very uncomfortable. But it's also in keeping of what would happen when a very serious matter is being spoken of. So this is what they're doing. They were witnessing in sackcloth, and these are the two olive trees and the two lampstands standing before God of the earth. Now, there's some very, very interesting parallels to this that you would read if you were looking at Zechariah chapter 4. So if you go back and look at Zechariah, of course, very much prophetic. A book that speaks without question, it's speaking of future things, though you can say, is it like many or most of the prophets that you find of the minor prophets in particular, that they would be speaking about things that were going to be taking place in the immediate or short-term history of either Israel or Judah. But if you're looking for a perfect fulfillment of a particular section of the Bible, you're only going to find that in the end times. That's the only place that it fits. But you're going to find that there are olive trees and lampstands mentioned in Zechariah 4. Many would see that what's being described there is finding its perfect fulfillment here in the book of Revelation. So the idea that God would fulfill things in the near term, but in the perfection and the completeness of them, it's reserved for a later time. The imagery of lampstands and oil and olive trees seems like it's beyond, for me, coincidence that you'd have those elements that you see here in Revelation and in Zechariah 4, because Zechariah is very, very much prophetic, very much future prophetic, especially when you start to get into like chapters 12 onward. Very, very incredibly focused on future events. So these are the two olive trees and the two lampstands that are standing before God of the earth. Now, the word lampstands here is the same word that you found in the lampstands that were recognized as the churches and what the churches were supposed to do. And so they were supposed to be the ones who would give direction. The idea of olive trees, again, that's an imagery that you find that speaks so much of a Jewish mentality. Again, the olive trees that are mentioned in Zechariah are referred to as two prophets. And so, again, there's lots of speculation when you look there as well. Once again, it's like here. Well, who are they? Well, we don't know, but we know some characteristics about them. So the idea of olive trees, again, if you're burning oil, the oil in lamps is, again, it's going to come from the source of an olive tree. That's where your oil source is going to come from. But it's, again, that idea of illumination, that God is speaking and bringing things to light. This is what the witnesses are ultimately supposed to do. So people who want to get stuck in the tall grass of trying to figure out who the prophets are, why is the imagery of the olive tree, and they'll go back and look at all kinds of little minutia. Big picture, we get this, that in times, other places in the text, again, that Zechariah passage, as I mentioned, excuse me, I'm so sorry. When we get to that point, you see Zechariah gives that detail, and it has very much kind of the same imagery here that we'll see in Revelation, or that we're seeing here in Revelation. So these are the two olive trees and the two lampstands that are standing before God of the earth. And these ones, as they're saying the things that they're saying, remember again, where are they? And what's the location that all of this is taking place? So remember, you have John is told, measure, it's in Jerusalem, measure the temple, and we know that that will be taking place in Jerusalem. So that's where you have accumulated those who are in the city. There's Gentiles there clearly, and there are Jews there clearly. So these witnesses, are they focused only to Jews, or are they also to Gentiles? Well, whatever you would be saying to Jews, it would have a very much, they would understand the imagery and the things, the message that there would be of the witnesses to Jews, but it would certainly have pertinence also to the Gentiles, because it's all going to be pointing to Jesus, the Messiah. Think about how many of the things that the church understands that were spoken to the nation of Israel by Jesus when he was ministering to them. So the necessity for a forever sacrifice that would be made. So much of what we read of Jesus' own words were spoken to Israel, spoken to Jews, but the church is comprised of Jew and Gentile alike. So the idea of atonement for sin, that it's done in a substitutionary way, that Jesus was that atonement, he was that sacrifice, all of that fits. So whatever these witnesses would be saying would be testifying of Jesus and the people's need for him. Now, it's not too late at this point if people are hearing them. So he says, anyone who wants to harm them, fire proceeds from their mouth and devours their enemies. And if anyone wants to harm them, he must be killed in this manner. Now, these also have the power to shut heaven so that no rain falls in the days of their prophecy, and they have the power over the waters to turn them into blood and to strike the earth with all of the plagues as often as they desire. Now, it's these two bits of information that gives people the reason why they think one's Moses, one is Elijah. Because Elijah, if you remember, in his contest with the prophets of Baal, fire came from heaven, consumed the altar, and ultimately the prophets were put to death after that had taken place. But it was a way of God saying, the prophets of Baal are false prophets. The one that I recognize is Elijah, and he was able to call down fire. So that's what they see as the possibility. So the other one, well, why is it that they believe that it's Moses? Well, the idea of turning rivers into blood and turning water into blood and being able to do this on demand, and the idea of additional plagues that are not enumerated here, that's the kind of stuff that Moses did. So once again, we can look at places where you could say, okay, because of the details given, it has to be Moses and it has to be Elijah, because we already know that these are prophets that God worked through them in like manner. Fire coming from heaven, and whether it actually proceeds from their mouth or they call fire down on people, that's ultimately what Elijah did, or the idea that rivers to blood and plagues and all that stuff, that's what we saw with Moses and how God worked through him when he was judging Egypt. So again, there's lots of reasons why you could say, well, these two guys would fit based on what they do. If you step back from it and say, they're just the personages, but it was God who was doing those things. It's God who wanted fire to come down. He's the one who sent it. It didn't show up only because Elijah asked for it. God was using Elijah to call it down, but that was his intent all along. So once again, we're not told what all the plagues are. The only one that's mentioned here is blood. And let's notice one other thing. The fire coming down from heaven doesn't just happen by one of them, but it happens by both of them. So the idea of calling down the plagues, it's not left in the hands of one, Moses, if that's what it is here. They're both able to do this at will, as they see, by their discretion. So anybody who tries to come at them and to destroy them, they're going to have fire come down on them. They're the ones who are going to be judged. So no harm can come to them because God sees to it. So again, we don't want to get so locked into stuff because we've heard it repeated so many times. Is it Elijah? Is it Moses? It could be. Is it a combination of them and some other prophet? There's still going to be two of them. So which two are they? We simply don't know. Could it be two that we don't even know, and that God is judging as he has done in the past, as like what he did with Elijah and with Moses, but it's two different personages? Yeah, sure, make that case. Doesn't matter. It's not the persons. It's not who they are. That's not the important part. These are people that God is using to testify to Jew and I believe Gentile alike, because they're present as well. They both have the same pressing need. They need to come to a saving knowledge of Jesus, Messiah, in order to escape what has taken place and about to take place even further. They're about to be confronted with, you need to pledge your allegiance spiritually to the image and the beast that is there, or you're going to be put to death for it. So their message is going to resonate with the people right there and now, and it's a call to come to a saving knowledge of Messiah or be judged. That would be the only reason for them testifying. So those are the important parts of what we're looking at here. We're kind of out of time for today. We're going to pick up what happens to them next. Now, I know I've thrown out a ton of information here, so if you have any questions on any of what I've shared, or if you are curious about the image that I've put up here of the picture and the satellite and all that stuff, please contact me through the ministry's website, oldpaththeology.net. I'll be happy to go over it with you and get you further information if you'd like. Any other questions, please contact us again through the email that's on oldpaththeology.net. And if there's things that you find kind of interesting in this and you thought, we're going to start wanting to make little shorts or little clips, and so if that's the case and you see something, man, I'd really like to see that made into a clip, 30 seconds, a minute, whatever, let me know. Just say, hey, on the study on such and such topic at from the 38 minutes 5 seconds to chapter or to minutes 40 to the 8th second. I don't know, that minute or so. If you've got something like that and you think it's interesting, let me know. Contact me through the ministry's website. I want to thank those of you who have already done so. And again, as we go through this, there's a lot of interesting stuff here. Let's not be so dogmatic about stuff. If for some reason we see something, we may really be sold to a particular verse, or a version rather, or interpretation of a particular passage. But if we cannot prove it, great. Have your opinion on it. That's great. But just recognize and be gracious towards those who might disagree with you on this. As far as, like the person, just the Moses and Elijah, that kind of stuff. That's what I'm getting at. If you want to start saying, let's be gracious towards those people who are doing violence to the text by saying it's not even future, that all of this is over with, that Jesus is not coming back for the church and all that kind of stuff, different story altogether, because we're not even reading the same book at that point. But as far as the finer little minutia of this, where you can have a differing of opinion without doing violence to the text, be gracious. So again, any questions, please contact me, and I'd love to go over it with you. We will pick up next week of what happens to these two witnesses.